can get started, please. And I know we're in for a great program today, and we want to be sure we're on time, and everybody is able to get out at 1:30. So that's part of our plan here today. Happy Halloween, everybody. I see some of you wore your costumes. And welcome to the last SPAN meeting of 2012. In September of 2007, 5 years ago, Alan Pratt, Randy Ottinger, Paul Shoemaker, and myself decided that maybe Seattle would benefit by having an organization that focused on what philanthropists do and how we as advisors could be more effective in helping them with their legacy and their families' philanthropy. So sure enough, 5 years later, as of 2 months ago.
So Mark, turn that down about 5%.
Turn it down?
Just a little bit.
How about it back away? Is that better? 5 years later, we're 400% up in membership, and we have a lot of money in the bank, right, Terry? So we must have done something right so far. And I want to thank everybody, our founders, our members, our sponsors, but most importantly, our philanthropists, because without you, there would be no SPAN. So let's give all of our sponsors and members and everybody else. So if this is your first SPAN meeting, if you'd please stand up, and we'd like to welcome you formally to SPAN. Please stand up if it's your first meeting. And we very much hope you'll become a member next year and in future years. So for those of you that are first time to SPAN, we don't have lunch during the conversation. Lunch is served after Thatcher Bailey and Paul Shoemaker have their conversation. And then there's a table talk. So at the table talk, we have a table captain. So will the table captains please raise their hands? We want to be sure we have a table captain at all the tables. Yes, we do. Good. We're good on that. So that'll last about 30 minutes. And then there will be a time at the end for some membership announcements, of which I know our longtime member, Geraldine Bouchot, is going to invite us all to her Peace Trees Vietnam luncheon next week at the WAC. So other members, if you have invitations too for events coming up, that'd be great. So quickly, we're going to run through our sponsors, which we, again, hope will be sponsors next year. Without our sponsors, we really wouldn't have SPAN be such a great organization like it is. Clark Newber CPAs, Cornerstone Advisors, Filament Advisors, First Washington Corporation, Foundation Source, Helsel Fetterman, Laird Norton Tyee, Pacific Continental Bank, PG Calc, Pratt Legacy Advisors, Seattle Foundation, SightLife, I always like to say Rob Batter when I say SightLife, Social Venture Partners, Wellspring Group, and Whittier Trust Company. Please give our sponsors a big hand. And again, we hope you'll be a sponsor next year as well for the 2013 year. So without further ado, thanks to David Lewis, Thatcher Bailey is with us today. David asked Thatcher to join us. And Paul Shoemaker is going to be our conversation leader. Thatcher is the president of the Seattle Parks Foundation and co-founder of Bailey Boucher House. And Paul Shoemaker is the executive director of Social Venture Partners. If you guys could come up to the stage at this time, we'll begin our conversation. Please welcome Thatcher Bailey to SPAN.
Good to see you. So, in addition, around the Seattle Parks Foundation, my gosh, your footprints, your fingerprints, they're all over Port Townsend in so many ways, in education and arts, and all kinds of things. And I think a lot of folks know about Bailey Boucher House and associate you with that to a degree. And I think we can use that to kind of, pull a story out of that and pull some of the themes out of that. Thatcher's the philanthropy we're going to talk about today is clearly not just the money kind. This guy has practiced philanthropy and civic engagement in so many different and powerful ways. And I think that's part of what we want people to take away from today. So would you just say, just for a minute, what Bailey Boucher House is now, and then we'll kind of go back to how you got going with that.
So how many people are familiar with Bailey Boucher House, at least in name? So most folks in the room.
Yeah.
It's a skilled nursing facility for people with AIDS, HIV, and also currently for folks with other conditions that require special attention, like Lou Gehrig's disease, Huntington's disease, people who are recovering and need more care than they can get in a traditional nursing facility, and maybe a little less care than you would get in a high cost, high intensity hospital situation. Bailey Boucher also has a day program that serves hundreds of individuals, oftentimes multiply diagnosed with HIV, mental illness, drug dependency, homelessness, providing them ways to kind of, keep on their med regimen, which is actually really important to prevent the spread of HIV, but also give them a social life and all sorts of amenities of community that they wouldn't have otherwise. So it's always served this dual purpose. Huge range of populations have benefited from these services. Some folks migrate from the 35 bedrooms upstairs where the longer term care happens down to the day health and back and forth. But over the years, I don't really have the number, but an extraordinary number of community members of all kinds, of all walks of life have gone through that facility.
So when Bailey Boucher was sort of being created in the late 80s, early 90s, and you lost your partner, originally you didn't want to sort of dive into it, and then at some point you decided to do so. What was behind that sort of mind shift for you?
Well, I try to think back 20, 25 years. It was a very different world we were living in, and AIDS was emerging nationally and locally. Seattle was kind of a second-tier city, so we were a little bit behind the curve in terms of the caseload that was emerging here. My partner was diagnosed in 1987, and in those days, from diagnosis to death, 18 months was kind of the average length of time. So during that 18 months, a lot of attention started to be paid in Seattle to this burgeoning need. We didn't have the facilities or the kind of system set up to kind of take care of these folks. And I, meanwhile, needed to spend a lot of time taking care of Frank. So I was approached by the folks putting together this project. Betsy Lieberman, who'd done some work with Pike Market Clinic around a study by Robert Woods Johnson about what would make the most sense for Seattle to step up around AIDS care. I couldn't get fully involved in that time, but did get involved on an arts committee. They had an arts committee from the get-go, because the artist community during the early days of the epidemic on through has always been so extraordinarily attentive to what that disease did to that community and what that does to the larger community. And so there was a group put together to kind of figure out how do you integrate art into a potential facility like we were talking about. And that I was also I was publishing art books and been involved in Artist Trust during that period, so there was a connection with the art world. After Frank died, I was a little, what do you do? And it was clear that this effort had momentum and some extraordinary people attached to it, and it was a tremendous way for me to kind of channel all the various emotions I was feeling about my own loss and the loss I was seeing around me into a project that extraordinary people were galvanizing around. So
Yeah. So this is certainly where this story starts to sort of change and evolve our definition of what philanthropy is about. So I know one of the things that you did was you sort of started a lot of conversations with people, right? And I'm just really, and you described well how, times were different. I think most of us remember that. How did you sort of wade into that? How do you start a conversation? How do you engage people? How do you kind of start to help change people's mindsets?
Well, first of all, you find the core group who already gets it. And Seattle, as always, was ahead of the curve in terms of great political leadership and philanthropic leadership and community change folks who understood this was the moment, this was the need. Now, given that, there was still enormous terror around this disease. There was no cure, no one knew what caused it. It was all related with gay issues, which were still scaring people. So, and the other complicating factor about this project is we were going to locate it in a neighborhood that was in the process of gentrification, which has its own set of social issues attached to it. But there was a deep concern based on all these fears that, oh my God, this fragile economy of this neighborhood is going to go south because there'll be these AIDS patients walking around, doing laundry, the laundromat or whatever. And so a lot of the work that had to happen was simply door to door, house to house, having gatherings in living rooms, in part to, engage donors, but also to, more importantly, to really engage neighbors and help them understand that this was going to be a remarkable addition to the neighborhood, a remarkable addition to the city, and kind of slowly, person by person, alleviate some of the anxieties. And I think, frankly, I own up, I was a poster boy. I have HIV, and I think part of my job, and there were a lot of folks on the board who had HIV, part of our job was to kind of humanize this disease so that particularly if you knew people, they had to kind of put their fears together with what they knew about you and kind of move that whole conversation along. So that was, a pretty critical part of the evolution. There was some deep-rooted resistance, which we could talk about later because it has a nice little trajectory about how it got resolved. But yeah, there was a lot of fundraising we were doing, but a lot of community building around this project.
You might just want to say where it is, because there might.
Oh, so for those of you who don't know, it's at 28th and Madison. It's the big facility right there on the corner, and so it was Madison Valley at that time. Really was a neighborhood in transition, and there were a few owners of a lot of the real estate, and as I said, there was real nervousness about the transition anyway. And then you throw an AIDS facility in there, and you got a formula for even more nervousness.
So this is clearly a case where you had to raise money, you had to give money, but without the other work, the civic engagement, the conversations that go alongside of it, nothing happens anywhere like it did, right?
It's true, and in part what made this project ultimately so successful, I think, is that particular combination of the right time and the right people and the conversation that needed to be had and the folks that we were able to bring into those conversations to lead them, and a kind of relief that so many people finally felt when they got on the other side of their fear. And so many of the folks who were nervous or afraid or said no, eventually became donors or volunteers. Some of them ended up being patients at Bailey Boucher in the long run, and it eventually evolved into this kind of beloved resource for the neighborhood. I think, there's a video about the history of the project, and Ron Sims in his sort of inimitable, always slightly exaggerated but heartfelt and really touching way talked about how this project, was this turning point for the soul of Seattle. And when we did finally open the facility, opening day there were, I don't know how many thousands of people are there from all over the place, just so excited that we as a city, we as a community had changed the nature, not just of a conversation, but of what care meant for people with AIDS. This is the first facility of this kind in the country. I keep thinking there needs to be a book written about Seattle, just a list of all the things that Seattle has done first and done in a creative way. And I have to say it was an honor to be involved in a project that would be in that list in such a book.
Definitely philanthropy with a soul. You shared with me the other day just a little quick anecdote about how all of that work sort of came full circle.
There was one of the folks who owned a chunk of the property in Madison Valley was helping to fund a legal challenge to our siting at the facility in that place. And I mean, there was a whole thing that was going on. We had some terrific attorneys on our side, compassionate attorneys, with people who were kind of having that conversation at that level. And then actually during those years before I came on the board, I was part of the group that started an ACT UP chapter in Seattle, inspired by what ACT UP was starting in New York City. And then there was all this community kind of support building for this facility. And it was really getting down to the wire. There was a certain deadline that needed to be met, and there was, pending major lawsuits that would throw wrenches into the whole works, and a potential demonstration, I didn't organize this, but a potential demonstration by ACT UP in front of the Seattle Art Museum. There came a moment where the gentleman just sort of said, okay, let's get this thing going, and removed the opposition, and it was an amazing moment, but didn't prevent me from going to him a couple of months later and asking for a contribution, which he gave, which to his amazing credit. And then a couple of years after the facility was complete, his wife died, and he built a beautiful little park about a block from the facility on 28th. Just a beautiful place to go and contemplate. And he was in that park one day, and one of the residents of Bailey Boucher, many of whom use that park, was down there, and they sat together and had a long conversation about life and death and what's important and what's not important, kind of ended up hugging at the end, and it really felt like just the perfect piece of closure around what had been contentious and came to be this kind of coming together. So there's a lot of stories like that attached to a project that taps into such a community heart, I think.
Absolutely. So what would you take out of that? What did you sort of take forward from that? What parts of that experience sort of maybe lived on and was part of your future philanthropy, whether it's Port Townsend or Centrum or other things that you did? What would you carry forward from that?
I think it's something that probably everybody in this room is keenly aware of. This is not a big revelation, but it was certainly amped up in that particular project. And I hope all of you have been involved in something that was successful, and you keep kind of getting together with the people you were involved with it, because it's what happened during that was transformative for each of us and for the city that we lived in. So I think what we recognize, my job, I was a co-chair of the capital campaign, but and I remember going out and fundraising, but that was never seemed to be the main thing that was going on. The money it was very fun to fundraise, but it was this sense of connection to people who were changing their perceptions or understanding around this issue and this opportunity, and being very proud about Seattle stepping up to be a leader in providing this extraordinary kind of care. So I think it's just continually reminding ourselves, but we all know it's never about the money. It's about the reward that you get as a donor or as someone who's asking for money, being part of this conversation around changing and enhancing your community in really profound ways. And I grew up in Seattle. I love this city because I see this happening everywhere all the time. Now maybe this happens in all cities. I don't think it's true. I think we're really good in this town about coming together to solve complex problems in really creative ways. So if I move forward and go out to raise money for other projects, I always try to keep in mind what's the real conversation we're having here. It's not about a transaction. It's about a relationship that may be personal between a donor and me, but it's also personal between that donor and this issue or opportunity that is being presented to them for them to participate in, and for them to feel really good about being a part of it, and I think feeling really good about being part of a city that supports so much of this kind of work.
That's beautiful. And I think you partly already asked this. I was going to say you've definitely been on the giving side and you've been on the fundraising side, and I think that's probably true of a lot of philanthropists. Is there anything else you would say about sort of what not when you were giving it away, when you were raising the money from philanthropy, things that you learned about donors or or things that are important to you about donors? What did you sort of learn from working on the other side of the equation?
Well, I think most of us have an occasionally problematic relationship to money. That it becomes a metaphor for so many things in our lives that we try to either solve through various transactions or whatever, or get into fights with our siblings about an inheritance, or you all can name several ways in which the issue of money has kind of been fraught. And I think, in part, the main economy we participate in is this sort of transactional one, and I'm all for it. Great, new Grand Banks boat or beautiful Tom Kundig house. That's awesome. But that is a way that we participate in the economy to sort of distinguish ourselves one from another. And I think our philanthropic participation is the way that we participate to connect to one another. And as sort of maybe saccharine as that sounds, I think I really believe all the corny things are true in life. And that sense of connecting through changing your relationship to how you're spending your money is unbelievably profound. When I was much younger and we had a modest inheritance, we had a wealth advisor who talked to the kids about, we wanted to make some contributions, and wisely, we were kids, and he was very cautious about how we should think about this, and don't get too much into the asset base. But we also had this accountant, and he just recently retired, a family accountant, one of the happiest people I know. And he says, spend your money on what you love. And he's lived his life to that, and it's been a thing that goes through my head constantly. And I can remember some of the great things I've bought and owned, but I can remember almost all the the big gifts that I've made, and the big asks that I've made, and so many of the relationships that I've been able to develop as a fundraiser for 15 different projects, and treasure those. It just sort of makes me feel like I'm a citizen in a way that other transactions haven't.
So you had this experience with a wealth advisor and the accountant. It sounds like that. They hit both ends of the spectrum, right?
No diss on wealth advisors.
No.
This is this one particular person. I just, usually.
The happy accountant, that was a little bit hard to kind of translate that. I wasn't ready for that either. So I also said you were talking the other day, so I guess maybe what you could have told your wealth advisor then, what would you sort of say to these guys based on your experiences? What do you want these folks to know when they're having conversations with people about philanthropy and they're thinking about their clients and the folks they interact with and how they want to go do philanthropy in the community? What would you tell them?
Well, I'd riff off the accountant basically, and what does preservation of capital really mean ultimately? I think where is that capital being preserved? And I think preserving that capital within the heart of a community that you're connected to, within the universe of a set of projects or initiatives that mean the world to you, that's a legacy that one can feel as good about as any legacy you leave through an inheritance, or in fact, I believe can be a great model to children moving forward about kind of how we make a place for ourselves and for others in the world moving forward. So I think it's not so much the moral thing to do, it actually is the thing that I think ultimately enriches your own life. And there's that famous quote that when right, like the essence of it, right? When someone gives you money, it's really the person that you've asked who should do the thanking, because they have the opportunity to participate in something that gives them meaning. And I think it's sometimes a difficult case to make, but actually it's true. I profoundly believe that our participation in community philanthropically is what gives meaning and actually bottom line value. So I would nudge some of those folks you're working with not to, because I think most people understand that, and a little bit of nudging to kind of let them understand that, yes, that is true. That is one way to, a really powerful way to capture value, is something I would hope more people would be doing.
Good. So I have a few other questions, but I want to start opening up to folks out here. What kinds of things do folks want to ask Thatcher? I can wait you out.
Denise.
So what is it about your family and books? And, what happened to your book publishing business?
So would you repeat the question so folks can hear?
Denise asked me what happened to what is it about my family and books and publishing, I guess, and
Right.
What happened to my own publishing endeavors. My father had a weekly news magazine in Seattle that I'm not sure anyone here is old enough to remember, called The Argus. And my sister had some bookstores, B. Bailey Books downtown and Bailey Coy on Broadway, and I had a successful niche, which read not much profit, publishing business. I did art and cultural criticism with kind of New York based, and then I ran a poetry press up in Port Townsend. I just think I don't know if you have to have a special fascination around books to want to get them out into the world. I think they're beautiful objects, and reading is an amazing form of communication. I'm so glad not to be involved in publishing right now. It's just a completely different world. I certainly wouldn't be publishing books if I were in publishing right now. So,
Good. Thanks. Fidelma.
Hey, Thatcher, so you've had such a critical involvement in so many things. I hope you'll talk more about the waterfront and the parks and all of that landscape change in the city. I'm just curious if you've ever considered running for elected office. Such an amazing leader.
We'll find out your sanity here.
Fidelma. I've worked a lot with elected officials and folks in government, and really admire that kind of dedication and the kind of temperament that's required to be successful in that sphere. Don't have the skills or the temperament to do that, and I think I'm too old, and we need younger leaders.
I was just going to sign up to be your campaign manager.
Oh. Fidelma and I have a connection through Artist Trust, which she ran brilliantly for a long time, and I was involved in years ago. So.
Yeah. Other folks, yes, sir.
With the Parks Foundation, you've stepped into an organization that's relatively new, and in a city and a culture where parks were something that our government did for us. There were city parks, there were state parks, there were national parks, and this notion of that it's something that people should give to is pretty new. How is that going?
Well, I think it's going. Here's a factoid for you all, which is kind of blew me away. We did some analysis of kind of private sector participation in Seattle's park system, and found out that every year about 54% of the revenues that go into the entire system are generated through philanthropy. I think we included the aquarium in that as well. Fees that people pay and volunteer hours that people contribute. So there's an enormous amount of private sector participation already built into the park system. And Seattle was really a leader in making a lot of those, and Bob, we're a leader in making a lot of that kind of partnership happen. If you look around the country, there is an enormous amount of private sector engagement in providing public benefit. In Seattle, I think there's some concerns that, well, we don't really want to sell our parks out to the private sector. But again, getting back to my earlier comment, we can't just assume that private sector means private interest. The private sector is deeply connected to public benefit, and not just for bottom line purposes. Now, I read an interesting article this morning in the Times about the $100 million gift to Central Park Conservancy, and someone was upset because there are a lot of other parks in that system that don't get that kind of funding. So there are issues attached to it, but people do want to step up, and we're can't give anything away. We are stepping up our ability to provide funds to projects within the system, leverage those funds with other dollars, and we see that the surface has just been barely scratched in terms of people's willingness to provide support for a park system that they clearly love. And this isn't going to replace public dollars. The idea is the more private sector dollars, the more public sector dollars, all ships rise with the tide. So I'm kind of amazed at how little general park fundraising has happened and what the capacity, I think, for the city is.
Thatcher, if you could back up to the first sentence of that paragraph that you talked about, private, what private investment does not mean private. Can you just go back to that first sentence you said, beginning of that paragraph, with assumptions about putting money in?
Oh, about Seattle's,
Just 1 minute ago.
about the concern that private investment is a step towards privatization of
Right.
public
Just
space.
review that, please.
I think, that's not a completely crazy concern, but I also think there's an enormous amount of kind of watchdogging to make sure that doesn't happen. And I also think, ultimately, we've just done a series of interviews with 20 folks running businesses in Denny Triangle, South Lake Union area. Their relationship to their need for more green space and more trails isn't about having their brand on it or having gates on it. It's about serving, their employees, but also the public at large, and creating a great city where people want to live and people can move from point A to point B easily. So, as we've seen wealth in this country shift from public sector to private sector over the last 30 years. That's not going to go back anytime soon. And it's been heartening to see how many folks and institutions in the private sector are stepping up in really meaningful ways to ensure that the experience of public spaces and public trails is enriched and enhanced for everybody. And I think that notion, particularly in a city like Seattle, of equal access for everybody is always going to be a fundamental value. It's just who we are here.
So why did you kind of where did the Seattle Parks Foundation come in? Why did you take that on? How did that fit into your life?
I wish there was some grand narrative. I was in the last gig I had in Port Townsend. I was involved in an effort. That was at Fort Worden State Park, which is, if anyone's been there, it's this unbelievable National Historic Site, 100 buildings, things are falling apart. State park systems in real dire financial shape. So about 10 years ago, we started to think about how do we make this more sustainable? How do we bring some private resources in? How do we make how do we put people in these buildings and make this place come alive? It's a little bit like Magnuson. So I got deeply involved in that. I'm still kind of involved in that as a supporter, and kind of got intrigued with the whole notion of parks, public space, what can happen in them. And frankly, I've been living in Port Townsend for a while, and I really miss Seattle. I wanted to get back to Seattle. So the Parks Foundation job kind of came up, and it was like, perfect. I knew many people on the board. I knew the projects they had done. Great organization. It felt like an easy match, and so far it was the right move to make. And
Good. Good. How about other questions? Yeah, Randy.
Centrum helped shape Port Townsend and Jefferson County over the years. Do you have some stories to share about that?
So say what Centrum
well,
is.
Centrum, I don't know if most of you know what this is. Centrum was a creature of the Washington State Arts Commission, which established it back in 1972 with the establishment of Fort Worden State Park. There was this, back in the 70s, there were so many great dreams of how all sort of utopian moment. So we'd have this great park and great kind of destination center for coming and having meaningful learning experiences with professional artists from around the world, kind of be in residence there, have these life-changing experiences. Centrum was the organization that put Fort Worden on the map, and over the years has attracted, I don't know how many millions of people to the park, but also extraordinary individual artists from around the world and students from around the world. So it has been a huge kind of factor in the economy of Fort Worden and in Port Townsend. So part of the work we're trying to do at Fort Worden is really to ensure that kind of model of the residential learning, if you will, having these buildings activated by people who come and stay for a week to have these once-in-a-lifetime experiences with, master cellists or what have you, is something that will sustain the park into the future. So in a little town of 8,000 people, an organization, a big arts organization like Centrum, can be pivotal in both its economy and kind of how it thinks about itself and how it maps into the rest of the world.
Been there many times with my now 11-year-old, going to the gun barracks,
Oh, yeah.
down to the beach, right? It's a pretty cool place.
It is.
It really is.
If you haven't been there, it's actually worth a trip. It is one of the most extraordinary pieces of landscape in Washington.
Yeah,
So.
yeah. Randy?
I want to go back to just this conversations around philanthropy and the wealth advisory community, where you're getting advice. Because I think that the training and the focus of most wealth advisors is preservation of capital, right? So how did these topics come up in terms of philanthropy in a natural way between your accountant and you, or between your wealth advisor and you, when the mission number one was preserving your capital? How did those conversations happen, or how did they happen for you?
Well, in those two conversations, the first one happened in a slightly awkward way where we all felt like we were 12-year-olds being indulged but somewhat schooled. And but it was great. I mean, it's also, we were young, and I don't begrudge the advice that was given, like be thoughtful, you're going to live a long life, don't. I mean, on some level, I said to Paul, I wish I had listened a little bit more closely to the first guy, because, but not really. And the other conversation, we kind of went to him as a, oh my gosh, are we doing the right thing? And I think his ability to give permission to our desires and kind of not, and they were legitimate desires to be in the world in a certain way, kind of just flipped our thinking. And it might be nice to be sitting here with, the real dollar asset base that I had back then, but I don't regret a single one of those gifts that might have been a little bit larger than I should have made. In my life, I have a great life, and I feel I'm connected to many of you in this room and many people all over the city just through, but not just giving, because I never was able to give huge gifts, but through the giving and asking process. So I think it's that flip into just thinking about, again, what does it mean to preserve capital? Where are you preserving it? And if I could just go off on one little tangent, there's another.
It's your show.
There's some great folks at Philanthropy Northwest. Two of the smartest people I know run that organization, or run aspects of that organization, and they're looking really closely at, impact of philanthropy, but not just in terms of here's a project, here's the inputs, how effectively did that project get completed, which is an important thing to do. But they're looking at, what kinds of communities have a philanthropic sort of tradition and network, and what does that mean about how communities talk to one another and how they get together and solve problems, and how do you measure the cumulative effect of that kind of community thinking? It's a much more difficult thing to measure, but you can sort of see the communities that are prospering in terms of their civic investments, in terms of their overall philanthropic investments, and that's a different set of metrics that, I'm not sure that's going to appeal to everyone that you're talking to, of your clients, but there are folks who are going to respond to thinking about those kinds of investments, I think.
Good. Yeah.
I want to just say that your earlier comment and then this follow-up now really resonate with me, that when you give money into a community and you participate in how you give it away, that community sort of loves you back for the rest of your life. And that's something that's just so profound, that the community, when you look at the great libraries, the great parks, all kinds of things, you think, wow, what a great community I live in. If you participate in that, then people thank you repeatedly, and you see people use it, which is a quiet thank you, whether you get to hear it or not. And so I think giving it away is a really great way to get to watch it and watch it and watch it, and then have the creative return. You don't know how people are going to use it. You don't know how people are going to thank you. And so it was really nice to hear you say that. And it's interesting that both you and I have we lost parents apparently. And when you see how that just goes away and never comes back, it's nice to be able to give into a community and have it come back and come back and come back.
All right, very good. Is there one more?
Glad to hear that.
Right there?
Yes, I was wondering what your experience of now being a bureaucrat is in relationship to your philanthropic ask
Oh my God, am I a bureaucrat? I work for the Parks Foundation, which is no, oh my God, no. So we're independent. So I'm doing nonprofit work like I've always done, and many of my best friends are civil servants in civic bureaucracy.
There you go.
So you don't find yourself burdened in any way by working for parks, which is public, and you don't find that?
No, we have actually a terrific relationship with the Parks Department because we can bring a little value to what they do that they can't bring themselves. So and we can also be apart from them, and we can nudge them, and so there are parks foundations in most major cities across the country that have more or less similar roles as we do. Kind of, again, igniting public or private sector engagements in various ways as volunteers, advocates, and donors to the park system. I think it's kind of the future of how we make these systems work.
So one quick kind of last brief question. I just sort of wonder how does Bailey Boucher kind of fit into your mind and your heart today? Just
Well, I can talk about it in these high-level terms, as I've been trying to do today. But of course, it's a place that has all sorts of other meanings, I think, for anybody who's been there or had a loved one there. And so I try to use these models in my thinking as I move through life, but I also know that my whole connection there was based on, my connection to a life partner. And when I go down to the building, I feel that all these sort of layers and layers of connections that other folks have, and the kind of, let me just say one thing about what Bailey Boucher really offers. It occupies this place on the continuum of care in our healthcare system that is rarely occupied in any other situation. It's very expensive. The reimbursement system is like unique to Bailey Boucher. But what it's about is compassionate care. So if you've ever had friends or family there, you know what that's about. So and it's all about respecting us as human beings in this deep and powerful way. So I kind of go there and I have these connections to Frank, and then I have these connections to all the other people who had the privilege of experiencing, an illness there, an end-of-life experience there, and all the families. And I try to avoid the anniversaries and the celebrations they have because I just become a bit of a puddle. But I know that that's lurking underneath all of this, which I think is probably what lurks underneath so much of our giving, regardless of what it is a very emotional connection to something that really, really touches all our hearts. So I felt lucky to have an opportunity like that.
thank you.